What if the stories we tell children before bed weren't meant to comfort them, but to prepare them? A dying CIA agent's final confession reveals the bedtime tale was never a myth. It was an ancient ritual, and tonight, it ends. The nurse barely looked up when I walked in, just nodded toward the end of the hallway and muttered, "Room 17, he's waiting." Her voice had that practiced numbness, the kind worn by people who see the last chapter of every story day after day. I hesitated at the door. The air beyond it felt still, like the pause before thunder. He was sitting up in bed, thin as a skeleton wrapped in old paper. His eyes were sharp, though, not sick eyes. Eyes that had seen too much and filed it all away in neat boxes behind the pupils. He motioned for me to come closer, then tapped the tape recorder I held. "No questions," he rasped, voice like gravel. "No interruptions. Just hit record and keep your mouth shut until I say otherwise." I nodded. Hit the red button. The tape began to roll. "You ever hear of Project Sunroom?" he asked, but didn't wait for an answer. Didn't think so. That was the first time we realized the moon was not just rock, not just orbit. Something was watching. He closed his eyes for a second. Not in pain, in memory. I was 27 when I saw it. The pulse. We were stationed in Greenland, monitoring Soviet chatter. But every 29 days, like clockwork, a signal would rise out of the noise, high frequency, rhythmic, and unlike any waveform we had catalogued, not static, not Morse. It was too clean, too exact, something not human. He coughed hard, the kind that sounds like it might end him, but it didn't. He pushed on. We didn't think much of it at first, maybe a glitch, maybe cosmic rays. Then we triangulated the source. He opened his eyes and stared right at me. It was coming from just above the lunar surface, not space, not Earth, from the moon. He paused. The recorder ticked on. Outside the window, dusk was swallowing the last of the light. "You know what happens when the government realizes it's not alone?" he whispered. "Nothing. Not at first. They hold meetings, they classify, they argue about budgets. Meanwhile, the pulses keep coming." His fingers trembled as he reached for a manila envelope on the nightstand. Inside were old, faded photos, diagrams, an infrared scan labeled 1969. He spread them across the blanket like tarot cards. Then Apollo 11 happened, and everything changed. They didn't just go to land, they went to listen. Instruments you'll never see in any museum. They pointed them straight at the signal source. And guess what? His voice dropped. It blinked back. I didn't move. The hairs on my arms had already risen, a silent revolt against whatever I had just stepped into. "That was 56 years ago," he said. "And now I'm dying. But you," he pointed a bony finger at me, "you're going to tell the story, all of it, because the signal's changing. The intervals are shorter. The phase patterns are shifting." He leaned in closer, breath shallow. "This isn't a memory. This is a countdown." I looked down at the recorder, still running, still blinking red. And I understood this wasn't a story for tomorrow's paper. This was something else, something older, and much, much closer than we ever imagined. He said it started during the winter of 1967, back when snow buried the Greenland base in silence so deep you could hear your own blood move. The Cold War was in full swing, and the CIA had outposts all across the Arctic places so remote that even the Russians didn't bother watching. They weren't built for comfort. They were built to listen. Back then, he was just a technician, not yet a field man, not yet a believer. His job was to monitor Soviet military communications, track atmospheric anomalies, and keep the tape reels running through the long, bone-cracking dark. Most of it was static, dead noise. Every so often a burst of scrambled Russian or the hum of naval chatter picked off the Barents Sea. But on one of those nights, the machine caught something different, something sharp. It came in the middle of a blizzard, not from the east, not from the sea, and not from any known satellite. A tone, high frequency, almost too clean, no Doppler shift, no known modulation. He remembered thinking it sounded like a tuning fork pressed against glass. It lasted 7 minutes. Then it was gone. He marked it, filed it, sent it to Langley. He thought nothing of it until 29 days later. It happened again. Same frequency, same duration, like clockwork. "Nothing on Earth is that consistent," he told me, staring down at his shaking hands. "Not weather, not satellites, not people, but this was perfect, mechanical, measured." He wasn't the only one who noticed. Within weeks, a team arrived. Quiet men in unmarked coats. They didn't ask, they ordered. Every recording was boxed, every hard copy sealed. They told him the name of the project only once, and never again. Sunroom. He asked what it meant. No one answered. They just told him to keep listening. Soon, new equipment arrived. Specialized antennas, cryogenic amplifiers, signal splitters that routed the audio to a second hidden room. He wasn't allowed in that room. No one was. Then came the day they asked him to triangulate. "We need to know where it's coming from," the lead operative said, "not just direction origin." So he did. Over 3 weeks, using data from stations in Iceland and Alaska, they built a map. The pulses were coming from above the northern hemisphere, from high orbit, but not geostationary. Not moving at all. When he overlaid the data with orbital charts, the realization hit him like ice water in the lungs. "It's not orbiting," he said. "It's sitting still. Just beyond the moon." He paused there, as if the memory was pressing on his chest. "Back then, we didn't have a word for it. We called it a stationary broadcast anomaly. But I'll tell you now what I couldn't say then. It was watching, waiting." I leaned in. The recorder between us spun, silent witness to a secret buried in frost and frequencies. "And every 29 days, he whispered, it said hello." The old man took a long breath. The kind you take when a secret finally reaches the edge of your teeth. He said that by early 1968, the Americans weren't the only ones listening. The Soviets had caught wind of the signal too, maybe from their own Arctic posts, maybe from somewhere else. Either way, someone in Moscow was hearing the same strange tones, the same rhythmic pulses that never drifted, never distorted, never changed. And instead of confrontation, something rare happened. They reached out. There was no summit, no handshake in front of cameras. Just a dead drop in Vienna, a silent acknowledgement that neither side was in control of what they were hearing. The message was simple. "We know. Do you?" And the reply, just as stark. "Yes, it is not ours." The next step was triangulation. Using shared observations, both intelligence agencies worked in parallel, sometimes pretending not to, sometimes exchanging ghosted data through intermediaries who thought they were working alone. The result was unshakable. The source was not drifting, not orbiting, not bouncing between satellites or beaming in from deep space. It was fixed, hovering in a position directly above the lunar equator, slightly offset from the moon's dark side, a spot no telescope on Earth could see, a place no man had visited. He called it the Eye, not because it looked like one, but because of what it did. It watched. The name stuck. The Soviets called it Glaz. The Americans called it the Eye. Every file, every transmission, every whispered conversation began using the same word. The Eye. It blinked once every 29 days. It had no known power source, no emissions other than the pulse, no thermal signature. Just that strange, mechanical frequency like a song sung by something that had never heard a voice before. The CIA's internal briefing described it as non-terrestrial, non-hostile, persistently observational. But that didn't comfort anyone. The question that haunted them wasn't what the Eye was. It was why it hadn't moved. "Everything drifts," the agent muttered, his voice low. Even satellites, even stars, even continents. But this thing, it just hung there, like a thought that wouldn't go away. Soviet scientists proposed theories, gravity locks, alien buoys, cloaked monitoring stations. But none of that explained the one fact both sides could not ignore. The signal intensified during sleep cycles. That part chilled me. He said they discovered it accidentally while monitoring sleep behavior of station personnel exposed to repeated signal bursts. The data was subtle, but consistent. Pulse strength rose slightly during the hours when most humans were in REM sleep, across time zones, across hemispheres. As if it knew, as if it was listening. Not to our cities, he said, not to our weapons, to us, our minds, our dreams. He looked out the window, even though there was nothing but the pale wall of the hospice. That's when I stopped believing it was a machine, or a satellite, or a beacon. Machines don't wait, machines don't stare. This thing, it was patient. He leaned back into his pillow, eyes fluttering, like the memory had drained him. And we called it the eye, he whispered, because somewhere deep inside, we already knew. It didn't want to be seen, it wanted to see. He shifted beneath the thin hospice blanket, like the weight of what he was about to say had finally settled into his bones. His voice was softer now, but sharper too, like glass under silk. They lied about the payload, he said. Apollo 12, Apollo 14, 15, even 17. They weren't just bringing flagpoles and rovers. That's the story they sold the public. But the truth is, they were planting ears, not microphones for Earth, not to hear the stars, to listen to the eye. He told me the missions had been modified at the highest level, covert changes buried in technical memos, mislabeled shipping containers, even dummy experiments with names like seismic probes and thermal reflectors. But once those devices were planted in the regolith, they didn't point down. They pointed up. Each one was calibrated to catch the eye's broadcast. Not a wide sweep, he said, but a focused beam, tight, intentional, as if the thing knew exactly where to aim. The data came back scrambled. Not language, not code, but something that triggered instinct dream patterns, sudden vertigo, nausea in deep sleep, and in a few cases, more. There was one mission, he said, that changed everything. Not because of what it found, but because of what it lost. Apollo 17. One of the astronauts, he wouldn't say which, broke protocol during a scheduled EVA, just veered off course. The comms feed went silent for 17 minutes. 17. NASA called it a dropout, he said. Blamed it on interference from solar winds. But that's a lie. We heard what happened. We heard all of it. The black box audio, which was never released, captured heavy breathing, soft mumbling, and a strange high-pitched tone that seemed to phase in and out, like a string vibrating inside a glass chamber. Then came the whisper, not from the astronaut, from something else. No one could decipher it. The language was foreign, not just linguistically, cognitively. It didn't fit the shape of human thought. When analysts tried to map the waveform, they found harmonic spikes that triggered nosebleeds and migraines just by looking at the spectrogram. They quarantined the tape, he said. Built a lead-lined vault for it in Langley. But by then, it was too late. The astronaut returned to the module, but something had changed. His vitals were normal. His suit was intact. But in his own words, recorded just before re-entry, he said this: I remember standing still, but I was walking toward the light, toward the sound. It felt like a room, he repeated. On the moon. He stopped flying after that, the agent said, stopped speaking at press conferences, refused interviews. The man who had walked on the moon could barely walk through a grocery store without shaking. I asked if it had affected others. The old man nodded. They kept planting the sensors, he whispered, but the signal kept shifting, as if it was dodging them, adapting, learning. He looked at me then, eyes sunken but locked to mine like iron hooks. "That 17 minutes wasn't silence," he said. "It was contact. And we didn't send a message. We received one." The old man's fingers trembled as he tapped the arm of the chair, like he was trying to keep rhythm with a memory that refused to stay quiet. He didn't look at me when he spoke this time. He looked past me, through me, as if whatever he was about to say had never really left him. "When he came back," he whispered, "he wouldn't speak for 3 days. He meant the astronaut, the one who'd vanished from comms on the moon for 17 minutes. When the capsule splashed down and the cameras rolled, he smiled like the others, waved, saluted. But behind the smile was something hollow, something cracked, and the cracks only grew wider. They took him straight from recovery to an unmarked facility somewhere outside San Antonio. Not a hospital, not a base, just a building with no insignia and walls too thick for wireless signals to slip through. He was placed under 24-hour observation. He didn't eat, the agent said. Didn't sleep. But when he did finally speak well, that's when the alarms started going off. It was 3 a.m. when the nurse heard him whispering in the dark. She thought he was reciting numbers. But when she turned on the light, he was wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, lips moving steadily. The language wasn't Russian, wasn't Latin, wasn't anything. They brought in a linguist from Stanford, then one from Cairo, then a priest. None of them could pin it down. The speech had a structure, a rhythm, a rise and fall. It sounded like a chant, a sermon, or maybe a code. One night, they played the audio backward. That was when one of the analysts vomited on the floor and passed out cold. "You have to understand," the agent said, voice low. "This wasn't just gibberish, it was designed. Like it had been engineered to bypass logic and go straight into the bloodstream. You didn't hear it, you felt it. That's when they launched Blue Dusk. It wasn't a recovery plan. It was a containment unit. The tapes were magnetically sealed, the transcripts redacted to the point of white noise. Anyone exposed to more than 30 seconds of continuous playback had to undergo neurological evaluation. Half failed. One technician tried to memorize a phrase. Just one. He wrote it over and over in a notebook. By the end of the week, he had torn out his own tongue. No one ever saw him again. The astronaut was moved after that, the old man said. No records, no trail. Some say he died. Others say he still walks the grounds of a black site in Arizona, talking to shadows that aren't there. He leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw fear, not remembered fear, but real, living terror in his eyes. "I heard it once," he said. "Just a fragment. A second or two." He reached up and touched his temple. "And ever since, I dream in threes. 3 lights, 3 shapes. 3 voices whispering things I don't understand, but still somehow know. I didn't speak, couldn't. And that," he said, voice like cracked stone, "was the first time I realized we hadn't gone to the moon to explore it." He looked directly at me. "We went to wake it up." He was no longer active by then, technically. His badge had been turned in, his clearances revoked, and his file stamped with the word "retired" in heavy black ink. But anyone who's worked for the company long enough knows that retirement is a paper trick. You're never really done, especially not when the phone rings at midnight, and the man on the other end says only one word: Blue. That was how he came back in. They flew him out to a base that didn't exist. No coordinates, no call signs, just a patch of desert where wind never blew. The guards wore no insignias. The windows were tinted black. The badge they gave him had no name, just a color code and a number he was told never to repeat out loud. Inside, he met the others: psychologists, neurologists, behavioral analysts, even a poet from Cornell. Their job wasn't to analyze language or build machines. It was to observe. The subjects were all people exposed to the lunar signal. Not astronauts, Not soldiers, civilians. Men and women who had, by some terrible accident or proximity, been within range of unshielded transmissions test engineers, relay operators, one ham radio enthusiast from Kentucky who had picked up a strange oscillating tone on a broken receiver one night in 1979. He called it the humming god before gouging his ears out with a screwdriver. The team's job was to watch them, record behavior, note the shifts. At first, the agent told me, they all seemed fine. Lucid, nervous maybe, but intact. Then the dreams started. The dreams were never the same in detail, but always identical in shape. A cold light, a sound like sand running backward. A presence, not a face, not a voice, just the awareness of being seen by something that should not have been looking. Then came the behaviors. One subject developed an obsession with drawing perfect circles. He covered his cell with them, fingernails broken, bleeding. Another stopped blinking entirely. Claimed blinking gave it a way in. She died from exhaustion after 6 days. And one man, quiet, polite, well-read, simply looked into the corner of the room for 28 hours straight, then tore his own tongue in half and whispered a word no one recognized. Every device in the room recorded static for the next 9 minutes. We started to think, the agent said slowly, that it wasn't what they heard. It was what they understood. One by one, the researchers began to crack. The poet was the first to go, left a note that simply read, "I have seen the first sentence. It never ends." A week later, the neurologist opened his own skull with a microscope stand. He lived for 7 minutes. In that time, he scribbled a shape onto the floor with his own blood. When someone tried to erase it, the lights in the entire facility went out. By the end, the agent said, it was just me and one other man left. We didn't talk, didn't eat, we just watched the cameras. Watched the patients. He looked at the hospice ceiling as if it still had security monitors mounted there. And somewhere around day 94, we realized something horrifying. I leaned in, barely breathing. The patients weren't talking to us anymore, he said. They were talking to each other, in that same impossible language, across soundproof rooms, across sedation, as if something was using them to rehearse. He paused, not for communication. He met my eyes, and my blood froze. For arrival. He didn't want to talk about Nevada at first. His voice slowed. His breath got shallow. The edges of his words began to fray like something unraveling behind his eyes. I waited. He stared at the ceiling for what felt like a full minute before he finally whispered, "We were warned, not by words." By what came next, the facility was buried deep in the Nevada desert, one of those places with no signage, no flight paths, and no exit unless someone on the other end turned a key. It wasn't officially connected to Project Sunroom, but everyone there had clearance for materials labeled off-world adjacent. Their assignment was simple: monitor and test residual frequency artifacts recovered from the Apollo sensor array. Most of the hardware had been silent for years, until it wasn't. The first pulse came at 2:03 in the morning, a low hum, then a flicker. Security cameras caught a shimmer of pale light spilling across the main corridor, like moonlight poured through dirty water. It lasted exactly 6 seconds, and that's when things started to break. The men in the East Wing began reporting auditory hallucinations, whispers in languages they couldn't name but somehow understood. One of them walked into a wall repeatedly, saying, "She's outside, she's outside, she found me," over and over again. In the West Barracks, someone screamed so loudly it cracked a surveillance mirror. When the guards reached him, he was sobbing on the floor, clutching an old photograph that hadn't been there an hour earlier. It was of his sister dead since 1962. They all saw someone, the agent said. That's what made it worse. Not noise, not fear, recognition. Every report matched the same pattern. The light would appear, just for a second, and in that second, Each person would see a figure, not a stranger, not a monster, but someone they knew, someone they had loved, someone who was no longer alive, mothers, sons, husbands, a childhood friend who drowned in a lake 5 decades ago, all standing in the hallway, all framed by that impossible, rippling light. And they would speak, or more accurately, they would mouth something, no sound, no breath, just lips moving in the rhythm of something old. That was when the panic started. 2 men tried to open the outer doors, the agent said they had to go home, said their fathers were waiting outside. Security locked the base down. They thought it was gas exposure, some kind of mass hysteria. But nothing explained the fact that every single digital system crashed when the 3rd pulse hit. Lights died, feeds went black. And, in the absolute silence that followed, people began to weep. Not scream, not shout. Weep. One woman, Dr. Elaine Bissett, recorded her own hallucination before the shutdown, he said. It was recovered later from a buried tape in her quarters. She had seen her daughter, who died in 1974. Her daughter had held out her hand, smiling, repeating the same word again and again. When analysts enhanced the tape and slowed it down, they recognized the syllables. It was the same phrase the Apollo astronaut had whispered years earlier. "We think it was a test," the agent said quietly. A psychological fingerprint scan, to see how deep they could reach, to see how close they already were. He paused, eyes wet and distant. "And the worst part," he murmured, "not that we saw them, not that they knew what we wanted to see." He took a breath like it hurt. "It's that they smiled when they realized we would follow." The old man's voice grew thin as paper when he started this part, like he was already halfway back in time before the sentence had left his mouth. "It wasn't the researcher we were watching," he said. "It was his son, no more than 6, maybe 7 years old." But when he picked up the chalk, the whole room stopped breathing. The researcher, Dr. Matthew Krell, had been one of the last stable minds on the Nevada team. Brilliant, methodical, calm, even as the rest of the personnel were falling apart piece by piece. He kept his distance from the direct signal, refused to listen to more than a few seconds of playback at a time. Some said he was immune, but it wasn't immunity. It was deflection. You see, Krell had a son, a quiet boy who spoke softly and listened more than he talked. He was staying off-site, in one of the housing units for visiting families. No access to the facility, no clearance, no exposure, except something had already gotten through. One morning, the boy took a piece of white chalk and started drawing on the back wall of their temporary kitchen, not stick figures, not houses or suns or trees, but symbols, precise, straight-edged, geometric. The mother called it strange but beautiful. Krell knew better. He didn't recognize the shapes immediately, but something in his gut told him to photograph them. He brought the images to the base, ran them through the language analysis server. The machine flagged them in under 6 seconds. Sumerian, not just Sumerian, Old Sumerian, the kind used before formal script, ritual markings, invocation symbols, the sort you don't see in textbooks because most of them were etched into walls that were later buried in fire. He had never seen those symbols before, the agent said. No books in the house. No access to archives, but there they were, almost perfect reproductions. They asked the boy who taught him. He looked up, blinked once, and said, "The ones behind the moon." That's when Krell stopped sleeping. He started keeping journals, hundreds of pages, trying to trace the boy's drawings, trying to match the syntax, the pattern. He began recording their conversations. Most of the time, the child spoke like any other child. But sometimes, when he was distracted playing with shadows, humming to himself, he would speak in that same impossible cadence the Apollo astronaut had whispered. Just a phrase, a sound, then nothing. One night, Krell left a recorder running under the boy's bed. What he captured made him resign the next morning. He didn't even pack, the old man said, just walked out. Left everything behind, including his son. The audio was classified under a sub-project called Chorus 9. Only 3 people were allowed to hear it. One of them went blind within hours. The other 2 refused to speak of it ever again. They say it wasn't just a language, the agent whispered. It was a key, a sequence, a trigger. Later, when questioned again, the boy said something else. Something no one wrote down officially, but which the agent remembered like a nail through the brain. He said, "They're not coming. They're already here. They live in the part of the sky we forget to look at." The chalk drawings were erased the next day. But even now, the agent said, sometimes on the back of certain walls, if the light hits just right, the shapes still come back, like they're waiting for something, or someone, or a signal. He sat back in the hospice bed, breathing slower now. The morphine had dulled the edge of pain, but not memory. His eyes half closed, he murmured something about stories, how they weren't just stories, how sometimes a fairy tale is just the truth hiding in a costume, waiting for us to get old enough to understand it. That was how he found Project Nighthouse. It wasn't about espionage, he said. Not directly. It was deeper, older, like something crawling under the skin of history. Project Nighthouse was founded in the late 1950s, buried inside a Cold War psychological warfare division, so obscure it didn't even have a building. It operated out of embassy back rooms, front companies, and embassy staff posing as cultural attachés. Their task was to collect oral folklore from remote, uncontacted, or isolated communities across the globe, not for anthropology, not for language preservation, for patterns. They wanted bedtime stories, cautionary tales, nursery rhymes whispered around fires in forgotten tongues. Not because they were charming, but because too many of them said the same thing. The phrasing changed, he told me, but the message didn't. Some called them sky whisperers. Others, the watchers in sleep. The Navajo spoke of silent moons that bled light only when no one looked. Siberian tribes warned children not to fall asleep, facing the sky, or the dream stealers would crawl down the stars. In the Peruvian highlands, an ancient song told of beings who could live inside reflections of the moon, repeating what you say, but never quite right. Even in rural Ireland, they found a lullaby that ended with the line, "When silver eyes blink thrice tonight, don't open yours. They see through light." Over time, agents began flagging the same motifs, a glowing orb, a pulse in the sky, voices that arrive in dreams and leave behind thoughts that don't belong, always accompanied by warnings, never explanations. Somehow, they always knew to be afraid, he whispered. Not of violence, not of monsters, of being seen. One agent working the project in Indonesia went native, refused to leave. Said the villagers had told him how to close his sky. He was later found in the forest, blindfolded, mouth sewn shut, and a phrase carved into his arm in old Javanese. Roughly translated, it meant, "They cannot enter what is forgotten." That phrase became the unofficial motto of Nighthouse. Over 20 years, the program amassed thousands of recordings. Most were audio. Some were drawings, and a few were not classified by medium. The team eventually developed a mapping system not by geography, but by similarity. And what they discovered rattled the foundation of the project itself. Entire continents, separated by oceans and centuries, were describing the same event, not just beings, an arrival. A presence that began as signal, then story, then silence, and always the same order. The moon appears, the lights blink thrice, the voice speaks your name in a dream. And then, something wakes up. They thought they were cataloging legends, the agent said, but they were charting sightings, memory. That's when a decision was made. The program was folded into deeper black, the archives buried under new names. The people who had worked on it, slowly vanished from paper, not retired. Removed. Because someone had figured out what the stories were trying to warn us about. They weren't bedtime stories, he said, his eyes unfocused now. They were last words. The old man's voice dropped into a hush, like the story itself had ears. He glanced at the window not to look through it, but to make sure nothing was looking in. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. We were never the main characters. He didn't mean in the stories. He meant in history. Orion's belt, 3 stars in a line. Easy to find, easy to follow. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries carved their gods beneath that pattern. Egyptians aligned pyramids to it. The Dogon of Mali spoke of it with precision that baffled astronomers. The Mayans folded it into calendars older than ink. But why? Because they weren't looking at the stars, the agent said. They were looking at arrivals. Nighthouse files held references across dozens of traditions. Always. 3. 3 lights. 3 visitors. 3 questions. In one lost Babylonian text, the belt was called the Gate of Watching Skies. In a Siberian carving, the 3 stars were eyes blinking open above the bone of the world. Polynesian chants warned of skyward judges who came when the moon paused in its path. All unrelated cultures. All whispering the same timeline. First came the watchers. They didn't take, they didn't speak, they only observed. But observation has weight. It bends behavior, changes outcome. Like a scientist altering an experiment just by watching it. Except in this case, the scientist didn't wear a lab coat. It wore a sky. They recorded everything, the old man said. Every war, every lie, every promise we broke. And for a while, that was all. Until something changed. There were scattered mentions in the files, a disruption, a divergence. No culture names it clearly, but each hints at a betrayal. Something we did. Or maybe something we became. That's when the stories turned dark. In the Inuit tradition, the lights began to blink more slowly. The children were told not to look directly at them. In Zimbabwe, the Mhondoro spirits, once guides, became silent for a generation. A Cherokee elder said the stars were closing their eyes out of disappointment, and the 3 became judges. They stopped watching, the agent said, and started weighing. That's when the moon stories begin. That's when dreams started changing. That's when civilization started building things underground, not to protect against each other, but to hide from something above. There's a line in an old Vedic hymn so old most scholars dismiss it as nonsense that speaks of the sky's 3rd blink. When asked why it blinks only 3 times, the hymn answers, "The first is to see you as you were, the second is to see you as you are, the third is to see you as you will be." Tell me that's not a trial, the old man said, and he was right. Because the more he talked, the more I realized we weren't being hunted. We weren't even being punished. We were being measured. Every myth, every symbol, every light in the sky, a scale. And one day, maybe soon, the balance tips. The question isn't what they are, he whispered. It's what they think we are. He paused, staring again through that window, still half expecting something to blink back, and whether they're still watching or already judging. He told me this part slowly, like every word was a rusted key unlocking a door that had stayed shut for centuries. You think the church didn't know? He said, eyes half closed. They always knew. They were just smart enough to bury it under guilt, Latin, and candlelight. It wasn't just CIA archives he had access to. In the 1990s, during a joint psychological operations exchange with European counterparts, he worked alongside an Italian asset embedded in Vatican security. Not clergy, not academic. An archivist. The kind who knew how to disappear pages without ever leaving fingerprints. The kind who didn't fear God but something older. The document was known unofficially as Vatican Codex 88. It had no official catalog number, no digital scan, no preservation team. It lived in a box made of cedar and salt-worn leather, and it smelled like things that used to be alive. The text itself was mostly Latin, though older parts drifted into a dialect no one could identify with certainty. It had been copied, redacted, then copied again over the span of 700 years, and each version, no matter the century, contained the same phrase carved into the margins, as if someone had been desperate for it to survive. Beware the invitation of light. The codex was first attributed to a 13th century monk who had allegedly gone blind after gazing at a celestial vision for 3 nights straight. His final confession, scrawled in shaking script, warned of a false radiance that offered not knowledge, but surrender. He described a voice not heard, but dreamed that spoke perfect Latin without breath or pause. It promised understanding, peace, reunion with the divine. But the price was permission. They cannot enter unless invited, the monk wrote. They wait until we look back, until we agree to be seen. The archivist told the agent that this phrase had echoed through several suppressed writings, some attributed to mystics, others to saints who had disappeared without explanation. One entry from the 16th century told of a cardinal who vanished after writing only 3 words in a private journal. They asked nicely. And it wasn't just visions. The codex described a pattern of celestial anomalies, 3 blinks of moonlight, subtle changes in sleep cycles across monasteries, and unseasonal tides. It matched exactly what Project Nighthouse had discovered centuries later. The same cadence, the same timing, the same consequences. The most recent entry in the codex was dated 1968. That year, the Vatican Observatory recorded an unusual shadow crossing the face of the moon during a full eclipse. No satellite could explain it. The shadow pulsed. Not once, not twice, 3 times. The observatory was shut down for 48 hours. Every staff member signed a new oath. The archivist's cousin had been one of them. After that, the old man whispered, the codex was locked away. No further annotations allowed. Not because it was heresy, but because it was confirmation. The Great Deception, according to Codex 88, wasn't invasion. It was seduction, a signal wrapped in comfort. A message that doesn't demand, it asks. It tells you what you want to hear. Promises answers to questions no priest ever dared touch. It waits for your yes. It's always polite, the agent said. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since I arrived, his voice shook. Do not say yes. The old man didn't want to talk about MK Ultra, not at first. He shifted in the bed, jaw clenched, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, he looked like he was trying to hold something back, not because he couldn't remember, but because he remembered too well. You ever wonder why they really cared about dreams? He finally asked. It wasn't about control. Not really. Not even torture. It was about what dreams touched that waking minds couldn't. During the 1950s and 60s, under the tangle of shell programs known as MKUltra, the CIA launched what was officially categorized as experimental cognitive disruption studies. Unofficially, it was a hunt for something they couldn't name but knew existed, buried deep beneath the surface of thought. That's where the dream weapon came in. It began as a psychological operation, an idea that thoughts, if implanted during specific stages of sleep, could reroute behavior faster than drugs or torture ever could. They called it seeding, injecting concepts into the mind while the conscious brain was offline. At first, it was basic colors, shapes, suggestions, but, over time, the goals shifted. They started asking questions during sleep, not just suggestions. Actual questions, broadcast in low-frequency pulses during REM cycles. Some of the early volunteers, most of them, soldiers or inmates, began responding in their sleep, sometimes with words, sometimes with drawings, sometimes with silence so complete it felt unnatural. And then came Subject 13. He was a veteran, former Navy, mid-30s, no record of mental illness. quiet, cooperative, never caused trouble. The perfect subject. On the 5th night, the researchers initiated a new sequence, one designed not to implant a thought, but to invite a reply. A simple message, repeated 3 times in near subsonic rhythm. If you are listening, speak. The monitors registered a spike. Rapid eye movement accelerated. Heart rate surged, then leveled. And then he smiled. Not a twitch, not a reflex. A full, warm, almost childlike smile. And then, he spoke. One word. Soft, like a breath pulled through gauze. Here. That was his last word. His heart stopped less than 5 seconds later. No seizure, no struggle. Just gone. They performed an autopsy within the hour. No trauma, no chemical irregularities, no cause. Official file listed cardiac arrest during sleep trial. Unexplained, but not unprecedented. But here's what they left out. The audio logs continued recording after his death. For 11 minutes, there was nothing. Then, a whisper. Not from him. From somewhere else. It spoke in a language that broke the waveform reader, literally fried the equipment. The technician who tried to isolate it went blind in one eye 2 days later. The doctor who certified the death transferred to a private facility in upstate New York and never practiced again. And the lead researcher, Dr. Saul Renner, walked into the Potomac River 3 weeks later, holding a journal filled with one sentence written over and over again. They listened back. The experiment was shut down, the files sealed, but not destroyed. Nothing ever really island. That's when we realized, the old man said, voice cracked and thin. The mind isn't a closed system. He looked straight at me, eyes watering like they were staring into some endless corridor just behind my face. When you ask the void a question in your sleep, make sure you're ready for the thing that answers. He had a name once. A long one. The kind that echoed across dusty university halls. Dr. Ellis Maynard, expert in proto-writing systems and ancient syntax structures. But inside the agency, he was just called the translator. No clearance level, no official badge, just a contract, a room with no windows, and stacks of chalk drawings left by children who should not have known what they knew. The children came from different places. Nevada, Berlin, a closed-door research site near Kyoto. All were offspring of individuals affected by lunar frequency exposure or dream-seeding trials. None of them had ever spoken to each other. None of them had ever been shown the strange, spiral-lined glyphs etched into ancient stones. And yet they drew the same things. Dr. Maynard was brought in under Project Echo Nest, a spin-off operation tasked with cross-referencing anomalous child cognitive expressions with dead languages. He expected to find pareidolia, pattern-seeking, trauma-induced symmetry. Instead, he found language, not a cipher, not a code. A fully structured, recursive language with syntax, grammar, and temporal markers. One phrase kept appearing again and again across the children's drawings. Not in Latin, not in Sumerian, but something close to both. He translated it tentatively as, "The return has its rhythm." He became obsessed. He requested older files, earlier audio logs, even Vatican Codex 88, cross-referencing lunar pulse cycles with global sleep anomalies and ancient calendar systems. Weeks passed. He stopped attending briefings, stopped speaking to coworkers. He posted a single note to the team's internal channel. "It's not random, it's scheduled." 2 days later, he disappeared. No sign of struggle, no digital trail. His apartment was left unlocked, untouched, all electronics fried. The carpet near his desk was singed in a perfect circle, but no smoke, no heat damage anywhere else. Just a scorch mark and a lingering hum in the air like something had been there and then wasn't. What remained were his handwritten notes, half pages, coffee-stained, barely legible under layers of circles and underlines. They were recovered from his desk drawer, unburnt. One line appeared again and again in different variations. "We will think it was our idea." Another scribble in the margin read, "They used story as camouflage, dream as doorway, consent hidden inside wonder." But the worst was a page titled simply, "Return Schedule." It wasn't a calendar. It was a frequency map. Dates stretched back centuries, each aligned with documented mass hallucination events, religious apparitions, and reports of false stars blinking over sacred sites. The next one circled in red was less than 6 months away. The agency sealed the room, archived the notes, renamed the incident under a harmless classification, subject instability. But one of the recovery team whispered to the agent years later, over drinks and silence, that when they ran spectral analysis over the burn mark, something strange showed up. A voice, low, distorted, almost a whisper, repeating a phrase. "You asked us, you asked us, you asked us." The old man looked out the hospice window again, but this time not with fear, with sorrow. "They didn't take him," he said softly. "We gave him to them." And for the first time, I understood what he meant when he called them polite. They never kicked the door in. They just waited for someone to open it. It came through on a quiet Tuesday. The room was buried 3 levels beneath the Nevada desert. No windows, no clocks. Just a circle of tired analysts, 2 humming machines, and 1 wall-mounted receiver tuned to a frequency no civilian radio could reach. It had been silent for years. Just soft, static, like a whisper that had forgotten its words. Then, the pitch shifted. It wasn't loud. In fact, most of the team didn't even notice at first. A technician named Rowe glanced up from his monitor and said later that it felt like someone had just entered the room, though the door never opened. At exactly 13 minutes past 2 Greenwich Mean Time, the signal modulated. The static folded inward, became smooth, rhythmic, intentional, and then it spoke. Not noise, not symbols, a voice, human in tone, male in register, calm, precise, too precise. No breathing, no texture. It sounded like language imitating humanity, like someone had studied speech and was now performing it with surgical detachment. The sentence lasted only 3 seconds. 5 words. Each syllable crisp enough to cut. "We remember your invitation." That was it. And then came the ringing. Not from the speakers, from everywhere, from inside their skulls. It wasn't a sound. It was pressure. Frequency twisted into force. Rowe screamed first. Then Brenner fell, clutching her head. A third man, the on-site neurologist, simply collapsed in place, blood trickling from his nostrils before his heart stopped. 3 were dead within 60 seconds. 2 others were paralyzed. The rest, those who stayed conscious, described a moment of absolute stillness, like the entire room had been frozen mid-breath. And then it ended. The facility was evacuated, decontaminated. All logs were sealed under a new code name, Descent Voice. The autopsies were conducted off-site. Cause of death, aneurysm. Brain tissue analysis showed something strange, microscopic patterns burned into neural pathways. Not chemical, not biological, something closer to impression, like the memory of a sound that had never been heard before. The survivors were debriefed. One analyst, during questioning, scribbled something over and over in his notepad until his hand bled. A phrase. "We said yes when we dreamed." Later, when the agency tried to trace the signal, triangulation pointed toward one fixed location, not deep space, not a satellite. The signal had originated again from lunar orbit, from the same patch of sky above the Sea of Tranquility, the same shadowed region where earlier missions had reported strange telemetry fluctuations, where instruments blinked and then forgot they'd ever been on. The eye. But this time, it didn't just watch. It answered. And what it said wasn't a threat. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder. The old man looked at me, face pale, jaw tight. "You have to understand," he said. This wasn't the start of contact. This was the follow-up. I asked him what he meant. He exhaled slowly, voice so thin I almost missed the reply. It means we invited them a long time ago. We just don't remember doing it. And then he closed his eyes as if listening for a ring he hoped would never return. The old man didn't say anything at first. He just hummed. A low, strange tune, unsettling in how simple it was. 5 notes, rising, falling, like something half remembered from childhood and half feared in the dark. When he opened his eyes again, there was no mistaking the change in him. He wasn't just recounting now, he was reliving. We used to think it was coincidence, he said. Old songs, tribal chants, weird campfire ballads passed down with no origin, no author. But it wasn't coincidence. It was echo. The song first surfaced in the mid-1950s, tucked away in a forgotten box of wax cylinder recordings housed in a Philadelphia University archive. A field researcher, long since dead, had labeled it lullaby, Appalachian, origin unknown. But the moment the CIA's folklore division under Project Nighthouse heard it, alarms went off. Not because of what was said, but because of how familiar it was. The melody, soft, repetitive, almost hypnotic, matched a chant recorded decades earlier from a group of Aboriginal elders in northern Australia. Nearly identical phrasing appeared in a funeral dirge from Siberia, and fragments, same tune, same meter, were buried in the vocal traditions of pre-Columbian Peru. None of these cultures had contact. None of them shared language, belief, or migration, yet the song survived. The lyrics were worse, roughly translated into English. The words described floating eyes that never blink, mirror men with soft voices, and a great cold that comes before the sky splits open like a wound. It didn't rhyme. It wasn't comforting. It read more like a warning than a lullaby. And yet children sang it. No one taught them. They just knew. One field report from the 1970s described a 6-year-old boy in West Virginia singing the melody during sleep, matching exactly the notes recorded in the Aboriginal version, despite never being exposed to it. His mother thought it was gibberish, a funny dream song, until she heard the original played during a classified session and began crying uncontrollably. When asked why she cried, she said the song reminded her of her grandmother, but her grandmother had grown up in a different state, in a different time, with no connection to any of the study groups. Later, under hypnosis, the woman recalled being rocked to sleep while something whispered the song into her ear. Only she said it didn't feel like a person. It felt like the moon was singing, she said. The researchers eventually gave the melody a name, the Philadelphia Lullaby, but the old man said it had older names, forgotten ones. In a margin note of Codex 88, a phrase appeared once, Cantus ad oculos caeli, which translates to the song for the sky eyes. In Sumerian tablets, a symbol representing both watcher and cradle was repeated across fragments too worn to read, but always near images of moons, eyes, and something else, something shaped like a mirror, reflecting a face that wasn't human. They weren't warning each other, the old man said. They were trying to soothe the children, because the children already knew. He looked up from the bed, the hum of the tune still rattling quietly in his throat. You think lullabies are for comfort, but sometimes they're for survival. They keep you quiet, still, obedient while something watches from the ceiling, waiting to be invited in. Then he stopped humming, and the silence that followed was worse than the song. The hospice light flickered just once, as if on cue. When he said the word blink, he had stopped calling it a satellite, had stopped pretending it was some natural anomaly. By now, we both understood that the eye was not passive, not remote. It was here just beyond reach, but always watching. He said the pattern changed in early spring of 1989. Before that, the eye had always pulsed in steady rhythms like a heartbeat carved from radio static, But then the rhythm shifted. Not random, not noise, a pattern. On, off, on, off. Astronomers in 3 different countries flagged it independently. One in Scotland, one in Chile, one in China. They all described the same thing. A high-orbit body blinking at exact intervals, invisible to the naked eye, but screaming across radio wavelengths like a coded flare. Someone inside the CIA's Deep Signal Division ran the blinking through a binary parser. The result was not a message. It was coordinates. 7. Not in orbit, not even in deep space. They pointed down. All 7 locations were terrestrial, all mapped perfectly onto Earth. But what chilled the old man wasn't just the geography, it was the history. Each coordinate aligned with an ancient site. Not just ruins, but PowerPoints, places long shrouded in myth, ritual, and blood. Site 1. Göbekli Tepe, Turkey. Site 2. Teotihuacan, Mexico. Site 3. The Step Pyramid of Saqqara, Egypt. Site 4. Mohenjo-Daro, Pakistan. Site 5. The Stone Circle at Nabta Playa, Deep Sahara. Site 6. The Yonaguni Monument, submerged off Japan. And Site 7, circled twice in the report, was a crater near Lake Vostok, beneath the Antarctic ice. Each one of them was built before written language, before organized religion, before civilization was supposed to have existed. Each one of them had legends tied to sky gods, star visitors, or the ones who came before. The agent said the briefing room had gone silent when the 7th site was revealed. Not just because it was inaccessible, but because radar scans had already shown something strange buried beneath the ice near that crater. A structure. Geometrically perfect. Older than the ice itself. He leaned closer now, voice like gravel in a cold wind. "We thought the eye was studying us," he said. "We were wrong. It was waiting for us to notice what it had already placed." That phrase, "had already placed," lingered like poison. I asked if they tried to reach the sites. He nodded. "Some we visited," he said. "Others we couldn't. But everywhere we went, we found something buried. Not machines, not messages, but memory. A scar in the soil. A mark in the stone. Something meant to last longer than civilization." He said the blinking continued for 17 days. Then it stopped. Not a fade, a full blackout, as if the message had been delivered. And all that remained now was for us to answer. He looked at me then, not as a stranger, not as a witness, but almost as if I already knew what he was going to say. "We thought we were discovering our past," he whispered. "But what if these places weren't left for us?" He swallowed hard. "What if they were left of us?" And somewhere in the distance, through that cracked window, I could almost swear I saw the moon blink. Once, just once, like it heard him. And agreed. The old man's voice trembled when he said the word Portlock. He didn't have to explain what that place was. I had heard of it, whispers, mostly. A forgotten Alaskan ghost town abandoned nearly overnight in the mid-20th century. People said something had stalked the woods. Something had watched them from the trees. Whole families left their homes without packing. Hunters vanished. Boats were found drifting empty. Official records blamed harsh conditions. Locals told a different story, but no one mentioned what lay beneath. One of the blinking coordinates pointed there, south of the ruins, deep into the glacial shelf that creaked like bone under pressure. The agency sent a team under cover of geological survey. What they found was not geological, not even close. The vault was not carved, it was smooth, too smooth. A chamber perfectly ovoid, encased in what looked like black ice but didn't melt. No tool marks, no radiation signature, but the temperature near the object never rose above freezing, no matter how many heaters they brought in. And in the center of it all sat the Ark. That's what the team called it. Not because it looked like a boat, but because it held something, a metallic structure, about the size of a refrigerator, seamless. No bolts, no handles, no lights. Just one solid piece of unknown alloy, resting on a pedestal of natural stone. It vibrated softly, steadily at exactly 17 hertz. The frequency wasn't loud, but everyone could feel it. One man said it made his teeth ache. Another said he could hear whispers through his molars when he stood too close. Every dog brought near the vault would bark once and then back away, tails between their legs. The agency brought in physicists, linguists, even theologians. No one could explain it. The object had no power source, no resonance decay, no change in heat signature. But the hum never stopped. Someone suggested opening it. The old man's eyes flared at that part of the memory. "We tried," he said. "Tried drills, lasers, plasma torches. Nothing worked. Not a scratch." He paused. "Then we stopped trying, because something happened. One night, during a test, the hum changed. It dropped to 16.9 hertz for 12 seconds. That was all. But during those 12 seconds, every recording device in the facility stopped working, not turned off, not corrupted. Just blank, like time had skipped. And when the hum returned to 17 hertz, there was a message on the wall scratched into the frost. 7 lines, no known language. But one linguist said it reminded her of an early form of Proto-Sumerian if it had been written by someone trying to mimic human structure. They called in an analyst who had worked on the lunar signal years prior. She looked at the symbols once, then left the room and never returned. Her resignation letter was only 4 words. "It's not sealed. Listening." The vault was buried again. Concrete, steel, layers of false topography. All maps were redrawn. Portlock was erased from transit databases. Just another ghost town swallowed by weather. But the object still hums, still pulses, still waits. And the old man leaned back in his bed, breath catching in his throat. "It's not a message," he said. "It's a reminder of something we buried before we even learned how to write." Then he whispered, almost too low to hear, "Buried doesn't mean gone." The old man's face twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. He looked tired, like he'd been carrying a weight no one else could see, for longer than any human should. When he spoke next, it was with a bitterness that felt earned. "We built most of them," he said. "The discs, the triangles, the flickering lights in the desert, all ours." He wasn't talking about the visitors. He was talking about us. Since the 1950s, he said, governments had orchestrated the majority of major UFO sightings, not to prepare us for contact, but to distract us from it. The technology wasn't alien. It was black budget. Reverse engineered from something older, yes, but not piloted by anything from beyond the stars. They wanted noise, he said. Static. Misdirection. Because if everyone's looking at the sky for spinning lights, no one asks what's crawling through the basement of their own mind. In the late 1970s, a project buried under multiple layers of plausible deniability began testing visual projection systems in rural airspace. People in small towns across the Midwest, the Urals, and the Australian outback reported the same thing: glowing craft hovering above fields, lights that moved too fast to be human. The witnesses weren't lying, but the craft were. They were holograms, drones, sound cannons, shells of a narrative designed to train us to expect the wrong shape, to fear the wrong noise, to follow the wrong story. Because, he said, the real invasion doesn't come from the sky. It comes in whispers. He told me about a document known only as Subvoice. It was classified above top secret. Distribution limited to 6 individuals. The summary was simple and terrifying. Psychic intrusion, not mind control, not some silly helmet-to-helmet transmission. This was different. Deeper. The ones behind the moon, he said, they don't need ships. They need consent, a crack in the door, a belief, A thought. That's all. The tests began quietly. A military base in Romania reported a spike in shared dreams, entire barracks speaking identical phrases in their sleep. One soldier carved a spiral into his chest and said he wanted to be closer to the sound. He didn't remember doing it. In Canada, a weather monitoring station recorded 19 straight nights of elevated electromagnetic resonance. No storms, no solar flares, just a hum. During that time, 3 researchers disappeared. One returned, barefoot, in the snow, muttering something about the invitation song. When brought in for debriefing, he asked the same question 17 times. Did you dream it too? The old man's hands were shaking now, not from weakness but something worse, like his nerves were remembering something before his words could. You want to know how it happens? He asked me. You won't see war. You won't see lasers in the sky. No fire, no ash. The invasion comes when you stop questioning the voice in your own head. He leaned forward, whispering as if the room itself had ears. We will welcome them, not because we are weak, but because they made us want to. He looked out the window, where the moon hung low and pale like a witness playing dumb. 90% of the sightings were ours, he said again. But the last 10%? He closed his eyes. They don't need ships anymore. They are already inside the story. It started with the tides, but not the kind anyone expected. The old man said it began in 1978, off the coast of Kiribati. A seismic monitoring buoy picked up rhythmic pulses in the deep Pacific Trench, low frequency, perfect intervals, spaced exactly 29 days apart. At first, analysts assumed it was tectonic, a shift in the plates, a deep tremor, but the signal had no signature, no geological precursor, no aftershock, just rhythm. The same rhythm recorded decades earlier in Greenland. The same pulse that came from the eye, but now it was in the ocean. When they layered the lunar broadcast patterns over the Pacific seismic readings, something happened that should not have been possible. The two matched, perfectly. As if the moon wasn't just affecting the water, it was instructing it. The pulses grew louder, not audibly but in presence. They began to show up in unrelated instruments, hydrophones, whale tracking arrays, even deep-sea mining sensors. One scientist described it as the ocean listening to something we can't hear. The old man's voice went quiet as he recounted the next part. That same year, several coastal villages reported a strange phenomenon among the fishermen. Nightmares, identical ones. Dreams of white lights flickering just beneath the waterline, of shapes, smooth and large, moving silently under the boats. Of voices humming in tones they couldn't repeat when awake, but could hum in perfect unison when dreaming. One man, a lifelong diver, swam out alone one evening and never came back. His gear was found untouched on the sand, but inside his waterproof logbook, scrawled in charcoal, were 3 words. They are rising. No footprints, no drag marks. Just the message, and a trail of bubbles caught on the last Polaroid he took at sunset. By 1983, reports had spread to Chile, Japan, and parts of the Aleutian Islands. Fishermen spoke of boats that would drift off course for hours, then suddenly return to their exact starting coordinates, with no fuel loss, no memory of travel, and water samples filled with unknown microorganisms that shimmered blue under moonlight. Then came the dream alignments. A neurologist working with the agency under yet another buried project name noticed that patients in the 95 different continents had begun drawing the same spiral pattern during REM sleep. Not similar, exact, spiral within spiral, always counterclockwise. Always drawn in blue ink, even when other colors were available. When asked what it meant, one patient answered in a whisper, "The moon is calling her twin." The old man explained that ancient myths always spoke of the sea as feminine. Tiamat, Yemaya, Sedna. Water was the womb. The moon, her sister, the watcher. And The message passed between them. We had only ever studied the sky. But the sky wasn't alone. Beneath the waves, miles deep, there were structures. Not cities, not ships. Relays. Stations. Older than the ocean itself. Some thought they were dead. Some thought they were sleeping. Now, they were waking. He looked out the window again, the moon pale and perfect overhead. "They're not coming," he said. "They're already here. They just needed the moon to speak first. Then, softer, and now the sea is answering." The old man's voice dropped as he told me about a place he was never supposed to visit. A town tucked into the folds of Appalachia, so far off the map it didn't have a post office anymore. Just an old general store, a shuttered church, and a radio tower that was never supposed to be transmitting. It was called Station Echo. He said it had been built sometime in the early 1950s, under the guise of a Cold War relay. But the truth was stranger. The antenna wasn't designed to send. It was designed to listen. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., the station played the national anthem. No announcer, no commercial breaks. Just the Star-Spangled Banner on a cracked vinyl record, the kind that sounded older than the song itself. The engineers who maintained the system said it was just tradition. Something about maintaining continuity during power grid recalibrations. But it wasn't the anthem that drew attention. It was what came after. On certain nights, never predictable, never confirmed, the anthem would fade out, and something else would bleed in. A voice. Not broadcast, not transmitted. Just there, inside the static. No call sign, no frequency shift. Just a whisper caught in the ghost wave of amplitude modulation. The message was always the same. We have always been coming. The first time it happened, they blamed it on a prank. Some kid with a pirate transmitter. But the FCC swept the entire state. Nothing. No rogue signals, no bleed over. Just clean air, except for those minutes of impossible sound. The phrase repeated 7 times, always in the same tone. Calm, detached, not mechanical, but not human either. Like someone mimicking a voice they barely understood. The recordings were pulled, sent to Langley, labeled under a sub-project known as Midnight Gospel. Acoustic specialists studied the waveform for months. What they found didn't make sense. The voice wasn't riding the radio signal. It was the noise itself. Hidden within the amplitude floor of the static was a pattern, a fractal spiral compressed into sonic texture. You couldn't hear it unless you slowed the recording down by a factor of 300. When you did, the waveform turned into something horrifyingly familiar. It matched the ancient symbols carved into the vault in Alaska, the spirals from the children's drawings, the pulse patterns from the moon. Every layer of the story was the same story, a message sent in myth, buried in bedtime, echoed in the sky, and now in our machines. The agent said that after the 3rd confirmed event, they shut down the tower. Officially, it was decommissioned due to budget constraints. Unofficially, the team who sealed it heard the voice with their own ears, not through a radio, as they disconnected the last transmitter. One of them wept and whispered, "It's in us." The old man looked at the recorder between us, the red light still blinking. "You think this is new?" he asked. "It's not. This is the last chapter of a story older than language." He leaned closer. "They weren't warning us. Pause. They were reminding us." He closed his eyes. "We invited them. And now the invitation is being answered. Every channel, every dream, every whisper in the static." The old man didn't cough. He didn't tremble. He just stared, like the weight of what he was about to say needed stillness to hold it together. "They're not from another star," he whispered. "They're from another when." He called it the visitor's paradox, something that had haunted him since 1982, when a Department of Defense document crossed his desk under clearance too high for titles. Just a plain manila folder with one phrase stamped on the inside cover: Temporal Proximity Event, Alpha 1. The document was short, 7 pages, No appendices. No signatures. But it didn't need them. It outlined an event predicted by a Pentagon subcommittee that had been quietly repurposed from missile trajectory modeling into chronotemporal defense forecasting. Their findings? The things we called them didn't arrive from a distant world. They emerged from time itself. Not the future. Not the past. Later. A moment we haven't reached, but that they already remember. They were us, or close enough to pass through mirrors. One passage in the report chilled him. It described a theoretical civilization that had long since shed linear consciousness, that didn't experience past or future but rather swam through it, like fish in a looped stream. For them, moments were habitats, and Earth was one of their sanctuaries, but only once we invited them, only once we spoke back. He said the paradox was simple and unsolvable. We were receiving messages from something that hadn't happened yet, dreams from events we hadn't lived, songs from cultures we hadn't birthed, structures in the sea that had not yet been built but already existed. And when questioned by one of the program's lead physicists, a woman who asked the wrong question, the model collapsed. The question was this: what if they're not arriving? The old man repeated her next line slowly, like it had been burned into his spine. What if they're remembering? The implication was terrifying. That what we believed was coming had already happened. That the invasion was not a fleet or a weapon but a ripple backward, a memory pushing upstream. A correction. He said the moment he read that line, something inside him broke. Not from fear. From recognition. He had seen it before. A boy on a moonlit beach, tracing spirals in the sand without knowing why. A girl humming a lullaby from a language no one taught her. Patterns appearing in snowflakes under microscopes, shapes we'd only just invented, but that matched carvings buried beneath Antarctica. Time wasn't a line, it was a loop. And the visitors didn't travel across it. They were the loop. The report ended with a simple phrase: do not attempt to interrupt the sequence. Observation only. Integration pending. He looked me dead in the eye, the monitor beside his bed pulsing slowly. That's why they let me talk, he said. Not to stop it. You can't stop what's already remembered. He tapped the recorder one last time. But if you remember too, then maybe, just maybe, we'll survive the next loop. He said the patterns began with children. Not prophets, not generals, not scientists, children. It started in the early 1990s, during a rare planetary alignment that brought every major body in our solar system into a shallow arc across the sky. Hospitals in Northern Europe, South America, and the American Southwest reported an unusual spike, not in birth rate, but in neural variants. These children passed every medical test, but something was different. Not wrong, just off. They were quiet, too quiet, not withdrawn, just listening to something no one else could hear. And when they did speak, the words were strange, not eerie, but out of place for their age. Words like echo, fold, whisper glass. Doctors chalked it up to overactive imagination or speech delays, but the old man had seen the internal files. The CIA, NASA, and a few foreign agencies had already noticed the trend. They called them mirror children, born under alignments that echoed the one present when the moon was captured, if that word even applied. At first, it was dismissed as spiritual nonsense. Horoscopes for federal analysts. But then came the drawings, thousands of them, identical, different continents, different cultures, different hands, same shape, a spiral inside a triangle, pierced by a single vertical line, always the same, sometimes in chalk, sometimes scratched into school desks. Once, in one terrifying case, drawn on the frost of a morgue window by a child who had flatlined for 4 minutes before waking up and whispering, "They're already here." He said the phrase kept coming up, from kids who had never met, who spoke different languages, and had no access to media or each other. They're not coming. They're already here. The agency ran a clustering protocol, trying to find common environmental factors. All they found were the stars. Every child had been born under an alignment within 12 degrees of lunar perigee. Every one of them dreamed in shared symbols. A researcher once brought 3 mirror children together in a portable Röntgen controlled room with no toys, no pens, nothing, just observation. The kids didn't speak for 43 minutes. Then one of them stood, touched the wall, and said, "We're not remembering. We're waking up." The other 2 nodded, simultaneously. After that day, 2 of the researchers quit. One had a breakdown. The footage was erased. The children were separated, but the shapes kept appearing, etched into foggy windows, scratched into tree bark, drawn in sandboxes with shaking fingers. He said that part scared him more than anything, not because the kids were dangerous, but because they were right. They were never warning us. They were reminding us of something that couldn't be stopped because it had never truly started. An arrival that was actually a return, an invasion. That was really a reunion. He paused and said, "We thought we were the first ones to look up and wonder, but maybe we were the last." He looked out the hospice window, into the night. "They're not behind the moon. Not anymore." His voice trembled not with fear, but awe. "They're inside, the question itself." Then he turned back and whispered, "And the children are the answer." He leaned in closer then, voice lowering like the walls themselves might be listening. "It was called the Sleeper Program," he said, "and it broke something that can never be put back." He paused, blinked slowly. "We wanted to speak to them, to listen to them, so we started with dreams. The project ran out of sight beneath military hospitals, repurposed missile silos, decommissioned NORAD vaults. The public thought they were shut down, but the beds inside were warm. He said they synchronized the test subjects' circadian rhythms with lunar phases. New moon, first quarter, full, last quarter. Over and over again. Sedation was chemical at first, then acoustic tones matched to that 17.2 Hz lunar hum. After 7 days, most reported nothing. Just blackness. But after 29, the dreams began. Not dreams, exactly. Places, familiar yet impossible. Skies with no stars. A presence behind glass. A constant sense of being watched. The subjects began to draw. Some scratched at their skin to trace symbols with fingernails. Others refused to sleep unless strapped down. Then came the voices. One by one, the sleepers began speaking in tongues during REM cycles. Not random gibberish. A structured pattern, a cadence, a call. Recordings were taken, analyzed. When slowed down and mapped, the phonetics aligned with fragments from the Codex Aleppo, and something older, Sumerian root phonemes. Except no subject had studied ancient languages. Some hadn't finished high school. The 7th sleeper, codenamed Coral, never woke up. Not medically, not fully. She opened her eyes, but her brain waves showed no conscious activity. She blinked, breathed, ate. But she didn't speak until the 3rd week. That's when she said the old man's full name. First, middle, last, clear as a bell. He'd never met her. Never visited the site. He wasn't on any public documentation. His real identity had been buried for decades, but she knew, and when they asked her who told her, she said, the quiet voice beneath the floor. That was the last thing she ever said. He rubbed his forehead. They shut that room down, sealed it in concrete, but the hum kept going. Then came the final test. A subject was sedated and placed under lunar alignment during an eclipse. A blackout, no visible moon. No light. The hum dropped out completely. At 2:31 a.m., the subject flatlined. Heart stopped, brain inactive, but his mouth kept moving. No sound, just motion. For 7 minutes. Then he gasped, sat up and whispered, "Stop asking. They are already inside." He died moments later. Autopsy showed no trauma, no toxin, no seizure. Nothing. Just a man who went somewhere and couldn't come back whole. The old man tapped his fingers, slow and methodical. "They said it was a test," he murmured. "But it was never a test. It was a door, a pause, and then, I think we opened it. I just don't think we were the first." He said they found them by accident, not through satellites, not through spy planes, through silence. It was in the late 1970s, when a pattern emerged in dream correlation logs subjects from a specific latitude around the northern coast of Norway consistently registered no response. No anomalous brainwave activity, no lunar synchrony, no incidents. They slept through the pulses like stones beneath still water. The agency thought it was a data error, but it wasn't. They sent a field team under cover of geological survey. The target was a remote village tucked into a fjord with no official road, population under 200, no church, no school, no internet, not even then. Just weather-beaten cabins, a wind-warped dock, and faces that watched without blinking. "Most places, you see people smile when strangers arrive," the agent said. "Not there. There." They stared. They stayed one night. That was enough. The team noted something odd immediately. No radios, no televisions, no clocks, not even watches. And at dusk, the entire village would go silent completely, unnaturally silent. No voices, no dogs, no light in the windows, only sleep. The agent, back then still junior, asked the lead field tech what was going on. "All we were told," she said, "was they're part of a legacy network, watchers, but not like us." He remembered seeing a young girl drawing in the dirt, spirals, eyes, patterns like the ones found near the Arctic station. He asked her what they meant. She looked up and said, "Those are the ones who knock." The villagers wouldn't answer questions. They wouldn't write, wouldn't gesture. They refused to communicate about dreams or what they saw in the sky. But their walls were covered in carvings, faint, nearly erased. Glyphs that matched ancient Sami markings. And deeper still, cave etchings that bore eerie similarity to petroglyphs found in Mesopotamia. "There's a reason no one goes mad here," one man finally whispered in broken English. "We do not speak of what is not ours to know." It was the only sentence any of them ever gave. The team left the next day. One of the analysts, curious, played a recording from that visit while reviewing mission notes. It was just ambient noise, the wind and sea, but when slowed to 1/4 speed, layered over the lunar frequency, a voice, soft, repeating, "They hear what you say in sleep." The analyst had a breakdown 3 days later. After that, all data collected from the Norwegian village was redacted, sealed in a classified annex known only as Dormant Garden. Even inside the agency, no one spoke of it again. But the man, this dying agent, now whispering to me he never forgot. Because while most of his career was built around decoding signals, probing anomalies, mapping what changed after exposure, these villagers were the inverse. They stayed quiet. They stayed still. And somehow, they endured. "They're not immune," he said. "They're disciplined. They learned a truth we never accepted." "What truth?" I asked. He looked at the window, where dusk was falling across the hospice parking lot. "That the worst thing you can do," he said softly, "is answer back. The news said it was a malfunction, a technical failure, one of those launches that makes a blip on the ticker before vanishing into the static of daily headlines." February 2009. A European weather satellite riding piggyback on an American delivery system. It never made it to orbit. But that rocket didn't fail. It was shot down. The agent leaned forward when he told me this part. He said the name slowly, like it still tasted metallic in his mouth. Operation Blank Sky. The idea wasn't new. They had been trying since the late 1970s to block or scramble the lunar frequency, first with oceanic stations, then with terrestrial dishes. But nothing held. The pulses always adapted, found new ways in, migrated through light, through static, through dreams. So the next phase was orbital. Satellites, not for surveillance, not for comms, but for shielding. A net of black glass, positioned at calculated angles to deflect or scatter the transmission patterns believed to originate from the eye. The launch in 2009 was the first true test. Blank Sky 1. The satellite was fitted with an array of crystalline mirrors, laced with rare earth materials that did not appear on any public manifest. Its real function was hidden in a payload description that simply read, atmospheric interference modeling. Only 5 people on the planet knew the truth. 2 days before the launch, the agent received a message from an untraceable source. It contained a single sentence. "You are not the only ones with mirrors." He thought it was disinformation. Until the rocket cleared the lower atmosphere and the tracking signal went dark mid-ascent. No detonation, no collision, just silence. They recovered only fragments. All scorched beyond recognition except one, a sliver of mirror panel. It wasn't shattered. It was melted. The analysis came back with an impossible result. The structure had been hit with a frequency burst that scrambled atomic bonds without generating heat. There was no earthly equivalent. The official report? Guidance malfunction? Blame the gyros. Blame the software. Blame the clouds. But the agent knew. The timing was too perfect, because in the week that followed, there were 19 separate cases of mass hallucinations reported near lunar observatories across the globe. People dreaming in unison. People speaking languages they had never learned. People humming a melody that didn't exist until then, but matched a waveform found in the signal they were trying to block. It wasn't just that the satellite failed, the agent told me. It was that they noticed. The second satellite was never launched. The project was folded, and Operation Blank Sky was buried so deep that even mentioning it triggered a counterintelligence review. They don't like interference, he said. Not with the signal, not with memory. He looked at the ceiling then, eyes wide. They need us to remember, because remembering is how they arrive. I didn't ask what he meant. I just watched as the fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied. And in the reflection of the window, for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something behind me, a shape that was not quite human, watching, listening. The old man's voice trembled as he pulled a weathered folder from beneath his hospice blanket. Inside, page after page of photocopied memos, some redacted beyond recognition, others barely legible carbon smudges from an era before digital ink. But the titles were clear. Briefing to Executive Branch. Eyes Only. Lunar Psychological Risk Management. And beneath each, the names of presidents. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan. This is not new, he said. They've always known, and they never agreed on what to do. He started with Eisenhower. The year was 1958. A report landed on the president's desk, describing unidentified frequencies, soft, rhythmic pulses, originating from the direction of the moon. It was dismissed at first as Soviet jamming, but a few months later, a weather balloon recovery team in Nevada went catatonic after encountering a light signature that matched those same frequencies. The report called it interference. Eisenhower called it something else. He scribbled a note in the margin. The dream problem is real. According to the agent, Eisenhower was convinced the pulses were a form of psychological broadcast, not communication, but infiltration, not machines, intent, something non-human using dreams as a doorway. He allegedly commissioned a secret initiative, Project Sandglass, to study the effect of lunar cycles on military personnel. The findings were buried after 5 officers reported identical night terrors involving a mirror-faced entity speaking backwards. Then came Nixon. In 1969, On the night of the Apollo 11 moon landing, the president was reportedly handed a private communiqué from the NSA. It warned of an anomalous object shadowing the lunar module, triangular, silent, unresponsive to any attempt at radar identification. Nixon never mentioned it in public. But that night, before his congratulatory phone call to the astronauts, he reportedly paused for almost a full minute in silence. Just staring at the receiver, he called it the loneliest call I've ever made. But the one who disturbed the agent most was Reagan. In 1985, amid Cold War tension, Reagan received a black folder simply titled Contingency Visitors. According to the agent, it was compiled jointly by the CIA and the Department of Defense. The contents included dream reports from children in multiple countries, describing identical figures tall, faceless, and hovering. Some called them the floating judges, others the smile men. But Reagan had his own name. He called them our guests from tomorrow. He believed they weren't invaders in the traditional sense. Not extraterrestrial, but extratemporal. From a future so fractured it had to reach backward to seed its own genesis through us. The whispers, the dreams, the signals, invitations disguised as warnings. He told his science advisor that maybe they were not aliens at all. Maybe they're what we become if we lose our way. The agent paused after that. Let it hang in the air. They weren't just tracking what came from the moon, he said. They were tracking what woke up in us because of it. I looked at the pages again. Each line felt like a door creaking open. Every president had called it something different. Eisenhower, a problem. Nixon, a shadow. Reagan, a guest. But none of them ever closed the door, and whatever was on the other side, it was still waiting. The old man coughed hard, his hand trembling as he reached for the oxygen tube beside his bed. His voice dropped to a whisper, rasped and hollow, like he was already halfway somewhere else. He didn't look at me when he said it. He just stared at the wall, at something I could not see. There's a protocol, he murmured, one they never wanted to write, but they had to. He called it the Blood Moon Protocol. According to him, it was drafted in the early 1990s by a task force so secret, even its paper trail was handwritten and passed by hand, never digitized. The protocol was stored in a vault beneath Cheyenne Mountain, cross-referenced only by lunar calendar and threat codes labeled Second Invitation. The first invitation, he said, was the signal. That strange repeating pulse first detected back in 1967. It was an announcement, a prelude, a request for attention. The moon blinked, and Earth blinked back. But the second? The second was different. If the eye ever emits a second signal, he said, one that mirrors the first, but ends in silence, that's when it begins. The plan, he explained, only activates on the night of a total lunar eclipse, when the Earth casts its full shadow across the moon, when the eye cannot see. On that night, all known lunar monitoring assets go dark, radio silence. No satellites, no data feeds, no signals sent, no transmissions received. Military and intelligence personnel in sensitive roles are put into chemical sleep-induced comas to block dream channel vulnerabilities. Nuclear submarines are ordered to surface and power down for 3 hours. Even the astronauts aboard the International Space Station are required to be sedated. It's the one night we pretend not to be here, he said. The only night they might not be looking. The agent said he had seen the final pages of the protocol once, in a locked room beneath Langley. The language was colder than the moonlight it feared. It did not describe what to do if contact was made. It only described what to do if the contact could not be stopped. One line burned into his memory. If the invitation is accepted, all that follows is aftermath. I asked him what that meant. What invitation? Who is accepting it? He finally looked at me then. Not with fear, with grief. We already answered, he said. In the dreams, in the symbols we never should have drawn, In the songs, the children hum without knowing the words. We said yes before we even knew what we were saying yes to. I checked the calendar later, after I left his room. The next total lunar eclipse would be in 3 weeks. He died 3 days after telling me this. But before the nurses zipped up the bag, before they took away the body, they found something strange. He had scrawled a word on the wall beside his bed in trembling, broken letters, using what little strength he had left. It simply said, "Soon," and beneath it, in tiny looping script, "Don't dream that night." She was only 9 years old when he first told her the story, not as fact, but as fable. A bedtime story, wrapped in mystery and softened at the edges. He never meant to pass on the truth, not the whole of it, just fragments, shapes made safe by distance. Whispers turned to lullabies. He told her about watchers behind the moon, quiet as shadows, old as light, about how they listened through the static in our dreams. He said some people could hear them better than others, sensitive hearts, open minds, children most of all. She had laughed, curled up under her blanket, a stuffed bear tucked against her chest. She had smiled and asked, "Do they dream too?" He remembered pausing, then nodding. "They dream us," he whispered. It was the last time he ever spoke of it aloud. The following day, he filed a report, one final attempt to bring attention to what he knew. He called it a consciousness bleed, dream transmission convergence. He used their language, their terms, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic coldness. The report was stamped inconclusive and shelved under psychological observation. He was quietly moved into retirement. But the dreams never stopped. Not for him, not for her. The first time she mentioned the eye, she drew it in crayon, a black circle surrounded by teeth. She said it floated over her bed at night, that it hummed, low and slow, like a whale underwater. He burned the drawing. He tried to distract her, moved them to the interior. No view of the ocean, no moonlight through the windows. He took the batteries out of her nightlight, refused to say the word dream around her, but it did not matter. The last night began like any other. She brushed her teeth, asked for a glass of water, and picked the same storybook she always did, but she never read it. She only held it, fingers gripping the corners like anchors. He checked on her just after midnight. She was still there, still breathing, eyes closed, a slight smile on her face. By dawn, she was gone. They found her footprints in the sand, barefoot, delicate, deliberate. She had walked straight from the house to the waterline, never veered, never paused. The coroner said there were no signs of struggle, no injury, no alcohol, no drugs. And the strangest thing of all, her eyes were still open when they pulled her from the surf. Open, calm, still smiling. He tried to explain, to confess, to warn. But when he told them his colleagues, his superiors, even the priest who buried her, they shook their heads with pity. Called it grief, called it madness. He stopped trying, until now. In the hospice room, with machines hissing and time slipping, he finally spoke the story again, not as a father, not as a soldier, but as a witness. And as he looked past the ceiling, through some unseen veil only he could sense, his voice cracked around one final thought. "She was the first to hear them," he whispered, "but she won't be the last." He asked for no prayer, no forgiveness, only that the recorder stay on, that the story be told as he told it, even if no one believes it, especially if no one believes it. The journalist thought he had seen everything: war zones, mass graves, whistleblowers with trembling hands and blood on their shoes. But nothing prepared him for the man in the hospice gown, gaunt and wide-eyed, who beckoned him close with a whisper that felt like it came from beneath the earth. He didn't offer pleasantries, no name, no introduction, just a single sentence, spoken with the weight of someone who had spent decades biting his own tongue. "I kept the stories." Then he handed him a flash drive, plain, unlabeled, the kind you'd pick up from a gas station shelf and forget in a drawer. but the look in his eyes said it was anything but ordinary. The agent died 3 hours later, not in pain, but smiling. As if, finally, the burden was no longer his. Back in the safety of a hotel room paid in cash, the journalist plugged the drive into an offline laptop. What appeared wasn't a list of coordinates, names, or surveillance footage. It was something stranger. Stories, thousands of them, short tales, parables, bits of folklore, fairy tales, lullabies, some typed, some handwritten and scanned, others transcribed from old cassette tapes, warped and barely audible. The metadata was a mess. The earliest dated back to the 1700s. The most recent were time-stamped within the last few months. They came from all over Africa, Tibet, Argentina, the Arctic, refugee camps in Syria, orphanages in Belarus, abandoned Soviet science facilities, and Appalachian ghost towns. Many were from children, some from old women, some written in dialects so obscure the journalist had to use university linguists to help him decode them. But once he began reading, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Each tale began differently, sometimes with a forest, sometimes with a boat adrift, sometimes with a child who hears music when no one is playing. In one story, a grandmother tells her grandson never to whistle at the moon. In another, an old painting in a Romanian monastery bleeds when shown to sleeping pilgrims. They all varied in tone. Some were playful, some were terrifying. Some read like nonsense, dream logic scribbled by a half-asleep mind. But every single one ended with the same 6 words, and then they remembered. He said it aloud. Once. Then again. Each time, something about the phrase twisted in the air around him. The room felt colder, or maybe deeper. Like space had bent slightly inward. He called a contact at Langley. Asked if they'd ever heard of the Red Room files. There was silence. Then static. Then the line went dead. Later that night, his television powered on by itself. No image. Just snow. No sound until it wasn't silence anymore. A faint voice, buried under white noise, whispered those same 6 words. Not once, but over and over. The journalist unplugged the set. It kept playing. He threw the laptop in the bathtub. It blinked once. Then off. Now, he carries the flash drive in a metal box lined with copper, buried under floorboards in a town whose name he does not write down. He doesn't access it, doesn't show it, doesn't speak of it, but he dreams in phrases. He hears endings before beginnings. He sees children pointing at the moon. And every night, just before he wakes, a voice he swears is not his own, says gently. And then they remembered. It began with a whisper through the wires, barely noticeable at first. A flicker on satellite feeds. A momentary drop in signal clarity. At precisely 2 minutes past 3 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, every broadcast signal on Earth paused. Not a shutdown, not a black screen, a freeze. Weather channels locked mid-forecast. Talk show hosts suspended mid-laugh. Sports games stopped mid-pass. In hospitals, operating room monitors held a flat line that did not match reality. In airports, flight data hung in place, while security camera feeds continued rolling, though what they captured no longer matched the frozen frames on the screen. And then, the moon turned red. Not rust red, like during a typical eclipse. This was something else. It deepened from crimson to a dark, suffocating maroon. Its glow was no longer reflected sunlight. It pulsed an internal light, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing across the sky. Astronomers tried to speak. They tried to explain the anomaly in real time, but the microphones failed. Not the equipment, their voices, their vocal cords. As though something had reached through the void and quietly pressed mute on all those who might interfere. Then came the pattern. Telescopes tracking the eye, what NASA once cataloged as a geostationary artifact noted. Its movements had changed. It no longer blinked. It rotated, not on its own axis, but in relation to the Earth's magnetic field. And with every slow turn, a low-frequency hum passed through the planet's crust. Seismographs recorded no quakes, but animals panicked. People collapsed. Some fell into seizures. Others simply wept without knowing why. Across the globe, digital billboards blinked out. Streaming platforms stopped buffering. News sites became unreachable. But then, simultaneously, they all came back online, and every screen showed the same thing. Not a symbol, not a sigil, just words, simple. In every known language, on every screen. In the same font. No movement, no flourish. The invitation has been accepted. That was all. No date, no origin, no signature. In a remote broadcast station in Iceland, a technician named Einar ran diagnostics. He found no server change, no external breach. The message wasn't sent through the systems, it was already there, hidden in dormant code, like it had waited patiently inside the bones of the internet itself. Within minutes, power grids faltered. Not failure, something closer to indecision. Light bulbs dimmed, microwaves reversed, clocks spun backward. In Tokyo, a high-speed train arrived before it departed. In Chicago, phone calls ended before they rang. People went outside. They looked up. The moon no longer looked spherical. Not to everyone. Some saw it shaped like a doorway. Others said it was an eye again, but this time open, fully dilated, black and endless. One child in Buenos Aires described it as a mouth waiting to speak. In a cabin in rural Montana, the journalist from the Red Room files stared at the screen of his long-dead laptop. It had powered back on. No login. Just the message. The invitation has been accepted. He turned to the window. The trees were swaying, but there was no wind. First came the quiet. Not just silence, the kind that falls before a storm, but a deeper stillness. Radios played static. Phones stopped ringing. The low hum of civilization, the ever-present backdrop of cars, fans, sirens, distant voices, vanished. Even the birds went quiet. Dogs no longer barked. Cats stared at walls that had begun to thrum with something just beneath hearing. In hospitals across the globe, heart monitors ticked along with no alarms. But patients began to rise, still hooked to IVs and monitors, eyes wide and unblinking. They walked, not fast, not slow, just steadily, toward the nearest door. Nurses called after them, but no one responded. It happened everywhere. In Sao Paulo, traffic cameras captured thousands leaving their vehicles mid-commute, not fleeing, walking. In Cairo, satellite footage showed small dots emerging from alleyways, all heading to the western desert. In Oslo, an entire neighborhood emptied itself at once. Not a scream, not a shout. Doors left open, stoves left burning, baby monitors recording nothing but breathing. Not from the cribs, but from the parents, still asleep, already halfway down the road. Children led the way. Many were barefoot. Some still clutched toys. Some walked holding hands with others they had never met. In a frozen village near the Kamchatka Peninsula, a 6-year-old girl whispered to her brother, "We have to go where they can see us." Then they stepped into the snow without coats. It was not hypnosis. It was not possession. The agent, long since vanished from public record, once wrote about lunar entrainment. The idea that dreams could be aligned like tuning forks. That consciousness, when exposed to certain pulses from above, might shift into synchronization. The phrase he used, passive convergence. Sleepwalking as communion. Within 30 hours of the final broadcast, over 40 million people had entered the trance. Some walked for miles. Others simply stood in open fields or parking lots. A woman in Nebraska drove her riding lawnmower to the middle of a cornfield and waited. A teenager in Tokyo climbed onto a rooftop and sat cross-legged, hands on knees, face tilted skyward. None of them spoke, none responded, and none of them blinked. Air traffic controllers in Belgium reported dozens of pilots requesting sudden diversions, not for fuel or weather, but because passengers had left their seats and crowded the windows, silent and staring at the moon. One crew diverted to Reykjavik after the captain himself abandoned the cockpit and opened the emergency exit mid-flight. He survived. The plane did not. Governments enacted emergency measures, but they had no targets, no enemy. You cannot fight people who are not resisting. You cannot shoot people who are not attacking. You cannot warn people who are already listening to something you cannot hear. In New Zealand, a farmer tried to stop his wife from walking into the ocean. She was humming, a lullaby he had not heard since childhood. When he grabbed her shoulders, she looked at him, really looked, and said, "Don't be afraid. It's your turn soon." By the third day, over 160 million had gathered in the deserts, the plains, the mountain ridges, and along the coasts. They were not chanting. They were not praying. They were watching the sky, waiting for something to look back. The last sentence of the agent's tape was not a goodbye. It was a cue. You'll know when it starts, because the silence won't feel empty. It'll feel full. And then the tape clicked off. The journalist sat frozen, headphones still pressed against his ears, heart knocking unevenly in his chest. The room around him was dark, the kind of dark that feels like it is pressing inward. Outside the window, the stars were gone, not clouded, gone, a pitch-black dome with no pinpricks of light. Only the moon remained full, bloated, and entirely still. Then came the signal. It did not come from the heavens. It came from underneath. The seismographs did not detect a quake, but every compass in the building spun counterclockwise. Every hard drive in the journalist's office flickered, reset, and began playing audio with no source file, just a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat slowed to an impossible crawl. He stood up, staggered toward the window, and saw lights blinking in sequence on the horizon. Not aircraft, not buildings. The ground was blinking. The pulse went through his chest. It did not hurt. It felt familiar, like remembering the shape of a dream from when you were too young to speak. He turned on the radio. Every station was playing the same thing, a lullaby with no lyrics, and behind it, the whisper of children saying a name, over and over. A name he could not understand, but somehow recognized. In Nevada, old blast doors opened by themselves for the first time in decades. In the Arctic, cracks spread through glacier walls, not from heat or movement, but from sound. In the Amazon, trees bent slightly eastward, though there was no wind, all of it in rhythm. The bedtime story had never been a warning. That was the mistake. That was the lie told to comfort those who found it buried in old pages, whispered in old dialects, encoded into folk songs and star charts. The story was not to stop something. It was to bring it forth. To complete the ritual, all it required was remembrance. Now they remembered. The journalist clutched the desk, but the surface felt strange, soft as if the molecules themselves were shifting. The walls shimmered, not visually, but acoustically. He could hear the outline of the room stretching. Somewhere beneath the floor, the hum grew louder. No longer a tone, a voice, not speaking to him, speaking through him. He dropped to his knees. On every device in the world still functioning, the message appeared at the exact same time. No server, no satellite, no data packet, just the phrase, "Now that you've remembered, we can come through." Above the Atlantic, a spiral of clouds formed in perfect symmetry. Not a storm, a lens. And behind it something moved. The moon dimmed, not from shadow, but from withdrawal. It no longer needed to observe. Its task was complete. It had stared long enough. It had synchronized the dreamers. Now it was Earth's turn to open its eyes. And it did. Not the soil, not the oceans, not the sky, but the dream that held them all in place. The frame cracked. The veil lifted. And through that opening, something began to step forward, smiling, as if returning home.